Thanks everybody for being here for this panel. I don't know why I sound, I guess this is my voice. It's not I'm very much a baritone. So I know like the song I'm probably gonna do is Never Gonna Give You Up, because I found it later.
You sound great.
Sweet. Okay. Let's do this. So this panel is called Cube 101, Cube Building for Dummies. Jay Bro invited me out last year to do this panel about how to build a cube, and it's relatively unknown. I feel like there's a lot of content, but not a lot about how to build a cube. And I wanted to do something like that because I feel like with content, people tend to want, it's like if I was building something and I wanted content for when I was just starting, I wish I had this, which sounds like a little presumptuous, but I do wish I did this. My name is Usman Jamil. Let's get this started. Thank you. So you may be wondering, who is this guy? My name is Usman Jamil, as I said earlier. I started playing Magic in 1995. I started Cube in around like 2008, 2009. Also going to be reading from this, so my apologies about this. If I'm not looking at y'all, but I'll try. But yeah, I started making a Cube in 2009. I started writing about Cube from a design-based perspective, because that really wasn't being done at the time. A lot of it was just kind of like, hey, Cube is cool. And nowadays you don't really need to do that anymore, because we're all here. So we all know what Cube is and how it's cool. I started the first Cube podcast called The Third Power. It all started in 2010, and then recently I started a new Cube podcast called Pack One Slick Ones in 2024. I also serve on several committees for guiding the direction and updates of a couple major cubes, like the official Pauper Cube that was originally started by Adam Stavorsky, and the MTGO Vintage Cube, which I assume everybody knows, but if not, it's a very popular cube. I also created the Ravnica Cube, which was on Magic Online during 2022 for a week as a spotlight cube. And there's other cubes that are on my link tree if you want to visit it, or just leave comments, or just look at it. But I have just like a regular cube, which is like Legacy, and just like a bunch of other weird projects. The idea behind this panel, and not just because Bob Ross is the go. So there was an episode of The Joy of Painting where Bob Ross was approached by somebody. The person who did it was colorblind, and he was like, "Hey Bob, I want to learn how to paint, but I can't because I'm colorblind." And Bob Ross was like, "I want to show people that anybody can do it." So I guess the exact quote is, a man came to me and said, "Bob, I can never paint because I'm colorblind. All I can see is gray tones." So I thought today, we'd do a painting in gray, just to show you that anybody can paint. So in this panel, I'll be talking about just like using the example, like a peasant cube, to kind of go through it, just kind of as an example. I won't be going through all the steps, but just some steps to kind of give you a little more context on things. Also wanted to use artisan or pauper or peasant as an example, because there aren't a lot of strong feelings. People are like, "Hey, why are you not putting in part X, Y, Z?" That's also something people shouldn't focus on as much anyway. We'll talk about basing cubes off of other cubes later on, but I want to just talk about the fundamentals and just how to do that. Even if you're basing it on popular list and riffing on it, which honestly a lot of people just do anyway, just so you can have that information. A lot of it is counterintuitive, but one thing I do want to emphasize, and I'll tell you in the next one, is you don't have to do it this exact way. When I started my cube writing, a lot of it was very prescriptive. I'm like, if you're doing this not this way, you're doing it wrong. It's probably because I was younger and now I'm old. But a lot of it was just kind of I want you all to take something away, even if it's just hey, this idea is really good, even if I don't care about the rest of it. Just to there's not one right way to make a cube. A lot of this is just stuff I've learned over the years, just kind of best practices that should help in terms of designing a cube. Because the thing about it is, a lot of it is just breaking it down into smaller parts, because it seems very imposing when you start, but after that it gets a lot easier. So the analogy that I found works very well in terms of designing a cube is just kind of building the foundations. It's kind of like a house. And the big things that you want to kind of focus on in the beginning, and it's two major points, is just what your beams will look like. and what the cube size is and the section structure is. It all kind of comes from the first point, but like the second part kind of goes to that too. Just kind of in terms of that. One thing that I found is very useful is looking at cube design through a couple major lenses, through macro and micro. And that might just be like, economics major brain, just looking at macro and micro. Just like sometimes in the various cubes worlds, I found that people tend to focus either on the big picture or the small picture, but not both. And they're both very important. I'll be using the terms macro and micro, and I just wanted to define it early on. So part of this, and a lot of this, is the macro POV. It's just like, what do you want your games to look like? And one thing that I definitely want to hammer here, and that's why I put it in here, it's like, it's okay if you don't know the answer to this. In Magic discussion, a lot of the times people have an emphasis on wanting to always know all the answers all the time, and like it's bad if you don't know, or like you may think that you look bad if you don't. But sometimes you just don't know the answers, especially if it's your first time building a cube. You may not know the answers to these kind of macro level things, and these are kind of the major ones, just like overall power level in the theme, guide rails, kind of define the metagame. Like power level bands, multiples of cards. These are kind of things you can use to kind of define what the metagame looks like. Variability, just things like that. But essentially, it's what your elevator pitch is. Like, for example, a lot of the times with a lot of cubes, historically, a lot of the overall power level or the major, what is the major archetypal kind of definition of things is just like a vintage cube. It sounds kind of cliche, but kind of is, honestly. It's like pauper, peasant, legacy, Ravnica based on like plane, and how that defines things from the top down. Essentially, that's where your macro is coming from. It's defining a cube from that big picture POV, and generally designers build so that drafters can maximize their decks and power within, even if they don't want to power maximize, but like drafters aren't going to draft, they're going to try to win. A lot of it just kind of came in the beginning where it's just like power versus no power. It was like at the beginning of cube design in like the early 2000s. And eventually, like as we've seen in the past few years, a lot of it has come down to not just power maximization, but other just like more kind of like vibe skills, for lack of better terms. It's just like if you want to include initiative or just like including multiples of cards, a lot of it is just this kind of curation from the top down. Also, the other thing which is not really talked about that often is like what's your cube's target audience? Even if it's just like doing it for like a big event, or if it's just like doing it hanging out with your friends and drafting it, your draft experience will be defined by that. And it's kind of like why I showed this picture here. It's just like very high level kind of crafting what the game looks like. And this kind of goes to that too. It's like in terms of just like designing a cube, a lot of it is kind of defining what your metagame looks like, which is a term you don't tend to hear a lot in cube design, but it's just essentially you are creating a metagame from what decks are. And you're not going to like, so this is the picture on the right is from Patrick Chapin's next level deck building. There's not going to be all these decks. Like, I can't think of a deck that has a certain control deck or something, but like everything else is just pretty macro level in terms of just like rock, paper, scissors, and theoretically you want to make sure that there's no dominant archetype. And that's pretty hard to do when you're starting. And then I would say don't focus too much on that. Just make sure that the macro stuff is defined first, and you can always refine later. So like this example here is kind of like what a metagame deck looks like. Green, white, mid-range in two very different cubes. The first one is from the official Pauper cube, and the other one's from the recent Arena cube, where the ingredients look very different. Like bottom one's Thalia, top one has Wary, Thespian, like it's very different, but the overall idea is pretty much the same in terms of just like generating value. But it's kind of like another thing where it's like the macro is kind of the same even if the individual parts aren't. So in terms of like defining your metagame through macro level decisions, these are kind of some examples that I kind of brought up in terms of this for like a peasant or a macro peasant cube. But just like where some certain parts can define what you're doing. Like say, not wanting anything that's banned in legacy or vintage. So like Sensei's Divine Top Ult. Or just like no one initiative, which would be like that second picture there with the Passageway here, or Brain Freeze, which is like if you just don't like supporting combo because of it being a relatively parasitic mechanic. And then like it also could be just represented by like other things like Borrow Scare. So like if you want to include those land or like certain types of lands. These are just kind of, again, really macro level decisions points that you'll make in the beginning. And you can always refine these too. I'll go more into that later. In terms of just like micro things, it's more just like individual things where they're still very important, as I talked about earlier, but it's just like where like I don't want to put Scott into my cube because it's way overpowered. So like I don't want to put in universe beyond stuff, so that I don't want to put Spider-Man in there, or just like I don't want to deal with the complexity of something like called the Depth Dweller. And sometimes it's just like I'll just put Cryogen Relic because I just like the card. It's a nice, simple, clean card that kind of does what it does. So in terms of just like the other points that I brought up, one of the main factors is cube size. And generally people tend to have their cubes defined in sets multiples of 45, like 365, 47, 20. And that's just been one of those old pieces of cube orthodoxy that's kind of stuck over the years, and you really don't have to do that. For the most part, it's been mainly just like if you have like a 540 card cube, it's where you have 3 packs of 15, and that's how much you can have to support 12 people. But most people aren't going to have 12 drafters for the most part, so it's just a relatively arbitrary number, and that's why I put that in the bold there. Like you don't have to do it in just multiples of 45. One of my main cube is like 558, partly to send a message, just to say, hey, you don't have to actually do that. The other point is that the expected audience size determines the floor, but not the ideal size. So it's like, if you have a cube that has a certain size, just know that it's going to determine like the maximum, or I guess that's the ceiling of how many people. Like if you have a 540 card cube, you can support 12 people. But that doesn't mean you have to do it like that. There's other pluses and minuses that I'll discuss later. Sorry, my phone's there. So there's various pros and cons of having a larger cube, and it's not just a one or nothing situation, but there's like various pros and cons that you can kind of use to decide if that's what you want to do. The first one for pros is it's just easier to include newer things. As we have less space, there's just less space to include new things. And like personally, because I write content about articles about like new sets, when sets come out, I really want to make sure that I have room to try new cards out. If I had a smaller cube, I probably wouldn't be able to do that. There's other issues. It's easier to accommodate more drafters. It's easier to accommodate more drafters as well. Say like you have a smaller cube, but more people show up. Suddenly you can accommodate more people. You have like a 500 card cube. There's also more variance, which I put in both the bottom as a pro and a con, because it can kind of be both, depending on what you think. In turn, there's more variance between drafts. So if you draft it pretty often and it's a smaller cube, you might just see the same stuff over and over and over, and it might just get old. Versus like if you don't draft it as often, it's probably not going to be as much of a factor. In terms of the cons, it can be harder to see impact from individual cards and possible dilution of themes. Just like if you know this card is weak, you're going to see like a Daze or a Force of Will, you just know it's going to be there if you have like a smaller set versus a larger. It's also harder to support A+B combos, which again might be a con, but it's certainly a thing. That could be a pro arguable if you don't want that to be as much of a thing, but probably not. You also just need more cards and sleeves. That's just what we initially talked about. It's like you just need more sleeves to get bigger cube, which can be annoying, and it's also like a bit of a cost factor too. But I said it before, it's also a con because it can just lead to less concentrated power levels, and just like a power level spike can be much more pronounced in a larger cube versus a smaller one where there's just more concentrated answers. I'll go over this in a little bit here. So like this point here about A plus B, in terms of this, just like in terms of like the classic splitter twin combo, which you don't tend to see in a whole lot of like super powerful cubes, but this is just a nice example. With a smaller cube, you're tend to be bottlenecked on your cards that create copies of things like splitter twin. But you have so many more options in terms of Deceiver X Arzelis and Quarter where there's like a billion things that untap things. But you don't have as many to make like copies of things. Like you have Splinter Twin, DPJP, and that's pretty much it. So you don't really have a whole lot of other options. But as you increase the size of your cube, you can increase the number of B. You can't really increase A as much. So it's going to be harder for that to get more consistent in the draft. Which is kind of annoying. It's why I made my proper cube when I had one 360 cards, because like there were some things like Grape Shot and like Temporal Fissure, and there weren't many options. Like I couldn't really increase it that much, so like having the smaller size definitely helped. In terms of like A plus B versus synergy, one point that I did want to bring up in terms of A plus B is like something like Stoneforge Mystic and Cauldron Complete, where it's just like an A to B combo. It's like, okay, you get Stoneforge and then you get Cauldron Complete, and that's your A to B combo. But in terms of this whole thing with Cloud, which is kind of like a, Stoneforge Mystic at home, what you can also do with that is use it as more of a synergy piece when other cards aren't available power level wise at your power level. For example, if you don't have room for like Astrologian's Planisphere in a smaller cube, as you increase it, you can also just do that as just a synergy piece. So that it's less about A plus B and more just about it being a synergy piece. It's also interesting because the context of the card can't change. Because you can have just say, okay, now there's just more artifacts that you didn't have room for. Or maybe you can support just other cards that can be signposts, or just like Nettlesis is just like, hey, drop a whole bunch of artifacts, which you may not have room for otherwise. Again, I'm not really a big fan of just saying that you should do a large cube versus a smaller one, but there's pros and cons with a lot of things. And this is a good example of that. So in terms of like the section structure, that was what I talked about earlier, in terms of just like this is kind of like building the wall of the house, in terms of just like you set the land, and now you're just kind of building the house in terms of that. And generally in the beginning of Cube, like back in the day, a lot of it was just kind of like very structured, there wasn't a lot of variation. All the sections were pretty much the same. Like the initial cubes in Toronto were very much based on like 60 cards remover and like all the sections, including multicolor. So it didn't really have a whole lot of variation in it, and you couldn't really address and sculpt to what your design was. Say if you wanted to put more colorless cards or lands, you couldn't really do that with that initial model. That's one of the things I talked about early in my cube writings. But these are some nice examples of some things that you can do in a 540 card cube. I found some examples of just like popular cubes that do this. I don't know if you can see it very well from here, but like some of the points are kind of highlighted where just like the second cube is a lot less white cards, and then the other one has a lot more like blue cards for the others. So it's like something you can do. It's generally easy to just have everything be the same, but you don't necessarily have to. But it's just something that you can tinker with in terms of just like your ratios and everything. Another thing is that what I would suggest to do, and again, this isn't like something that, if you're not doing it this way, you're doing it wrong, because like, please don't do that. Such absolutist things are never great. But one thing I tend to do is when I start a cube is I'll compile a list of cards and then I'll sculpt down from there. Just kind of like building a house, just like way overfilling it with stuff and then just sculpting it down from there so you know your options are and you can sculpt down to how you want to build your cube. One of the things that I did is like, you can use that to build your archetypes and things like that. Like some are pretty universal in terms of like red burn stuff, blue counter stuff. But essentially what you'll do, this also lets you keep an eye on things on a very, I would say a very macro level scale in terms of how you can see your archetypes and things like that. Again, you don't really have to, but this is just what I found tends to work well for me at least. And obviously not for everybody. So one of the things that I would found in terms of just like building the house, because I think that's part of it, it's just like finding what your options are. And like, it's a lot easier to just like go to search engines and just like type. Like if you go to Cube Cobra and just search for peasant cubes, or just like search for commons and uncommons. Back in the day, that mostly what we had to do was to go to search sites and then just like do dumpster dives through Scryfall to look at every common, uncommon. It's like all your red 3 drops, and it was not great. It took forever. And you can kind of outsource a lot of that by going to other cube lists or going to sites like mtgtop8.com or like 17 lands, and then you can use that to kind of outsource that evaluation. Like other cube resources do a lot of that work for you, and you don't really have to do it all on your own. You can get it so much easier if you outsource it other places. Same thing with like searching Scryfall, like searching sources like MCPQ on Reddit, or just like going to Discord and using that information. It's like a lot of building a cube is very overwhelming, and using these resources can definitely help to build that house. In terms of designing to a color, I know a lot of people tend to look at it through either designing to archetypes, like for example, if you're doing it through red, like red, blue, red, green, red, black, red, black, red, green, red, white, versus just designing to red. One of the things people tend to do is using the left one over there to use that as a way to guide design into archetypes. Like say red blue is like the spell slinger deck, red green is like the big stompy deck. I've never personally found that super useful, but I'm not going to advise to not do it. For me personally, it was a lot easier for me to just design to the color and then have draft archetypes flow from there. Someone said, like, a friend of mine, Tom, he said something along the lines of, like, don't be married to your ideas, but just kind of date them. And I think that's a great idea in terms of, like, building to a color pair, because sometimes people will just draft independently of what you're doing. And I think this is just a good way to do that, to make sure you're not just, like, trying to build to something that may not necessarily happen. But if you find it's easier to just build to the color pairs versus as a color a whole, totally do that. If it works for you, it definitely helps. But for me, at least, like if I was building to red in a peasant view, what I would do is just like power level spikes, lots of red early creatures, like 2/1s, and just like the early part of the curve, because most of the deck archetypes are going to be very aggressive based. Red 2/1s are a relative strength for red in the peasant world. And then there's some other stuff you could probably do, but I think those are the big macro level things that I tend to design down to. But then you have cards like Standstill, which is like, where exactly does that fit? It's an uncommon, and it doesn't really fit into like any of these, like, red, Azorius, Dimir is a Simic. If you think of it in terms of color pairs, because it's like you could say Blue Eyes control, Dimir's control, Simic is ramp, and is spell slinger. And like, it doesn't really fit into either of those, but that might be just a thing where it's just more of a major or a minor than a major kind of thing. And it could slot into one of those, but like you might miss out on something like this if you're thinking just strictly in terms of color pairs. There's also the idea of like synergies and payoffs, where it's like in terms of shades of gray, where there's like acceptable floors and ceilings for certain kinds of cards. Kind of like the whole Bob Ross painting. We'll call back to that. But like with the Argorthian Enchantment, for example, it's very much a parasitic card that just wants to play with other enchantments. Like if you play it and you don't have a critical mass of enchantments, it's just not very good, and it's just not going to make it into a lot of decks. So if there is a card like this in a cube, like an Argothian Enchantress, it's a signal to your drafters that there's enough enchantments to make this work. And that's hard to tell when you're designing a cube, because you may not know if that's a thing. But like you can also just jam through drafts on cube mode, which really helps too. There's other things like Galvanic Blast, which is a card that is kind of parasitic in terms of it being an Artifact Matters card, but it really isn't, because the floor is good enough. Or like Argothian Enchantments, the floor is just straight up terrible if you can't draw cards. Whereas Galvanic Blast is, for the most part, fine in a lot of games. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to hit Metal Trap, but a lot of times it just kind of points to that. And Heirloom Blade is like a card, like if you've read any of my writing, like, it's a card that I love to reference. It's one of those cards that taught me a lot of lessons. I actually wrote an article about it in terms of lessons it taught me in terms of cube design, where it's a card that just looks like very much like a Kindred card, that just looks terrible, but it's a card that just happens to work well in a lot of aggressive decks. And it's one of those things where it's like, this may point to archetypes which may not be there, but it's also just a good card, and that's just kind of like an expectations thing too, which can be easier to manage if you draft with people consistently versus if you're taking it to events and you don't have a consistent group, or it's like a huge overhead. In terms of redundancy, it's one of those things that I've seen over the years where it's just like some of the common things I tend to see in cube design are issues with redundancy, where it's just like cube has had an elevator pitch of being just like all the best cards all the time, but a lot of what cube design tends to be about is not necessarily the pile of the best cards, but you craft archetypes and you craft a metagame. And what redundancy can do, whereas like being worse automatically doesn't equal unplayable. But the idea of something like Lightning Bolt or Galvanic Discharge is that these kind of redundancies can shape what the strengths and weaknesses of what a color can do, but they can also determine things like it being good versus green, and that being a thing that green decks have to worry about, or if that's a feature or a bug. But also in terms of just like critical mass, because like Descendant of Storms doesn't look like a great card, and it's relative, but it's a card that helps decks get critical mass for decks that just want raw numbers. Aggressive decks are mainly just about hitting those raw numbers of years, and that's just like a thing, even if it doesn't look impressive. Like I would say one of the big things in cube design is just making sure you're having redundancy things. So now that you've kind of just built a pile of stuff, what you want to do now is kind of just sculpt it down. And like I said, you can do either method of just like doing it to color pair or to kind of do it by section. But what you want to do at this point is just kind of like, you're kind of sculpting it down, and that's why I'm a fan of that kind of analogy, is to kind of sculpt it down into what you want it to look like in terms of just like defining everything from the top down, and essentially just kind of sculpt these rooms and everything from there to kind of make it more cohesive. In terms of shaping your cube, there are things like using math and cube design is kind of part science, part art, and I would say like there's hypergeometric calculators that people use like sometimes to determine like critical mass and like what numbers you need, and it's not really something you have to do. But like if you do like hypergeometric calculator and like the rate of something in your cube, you can do it. You don't really have to. I don't think I've ever really did it. I've been designing cubes for like over 15 years, so you don't have to. But I do find that it's better to err on the side of caution with critical mass. Kind of what I talked about earlier in terms of redundancy, in terms of just like in general, when you're starting to just err on that side and you're sculpting down, and then just seeding payoff and just making sure the juice is worth the squeeze. I'm a big fan of that phrase. If the juice is worth the squeeze in cube design, it's like a lot of times it's just like, well, there's this thing you can do, but why? And that just makes sure that it's actually worth the experience. And then just using that to kind of sculpt down to what your archetypes are. But yeah, generally I tend to say that a lot of the sculpting process is a lot of push and pull. Like right now, you're just kind of seeing where your baseline is, and then just kind of seeing, oh, I need more of this or less of this. What you can also do is just kind of build up, especially if you're using like a cube cover page, where it's just like, I'm not going to go and like build up a whole big thing and then sculpt down. You can also just kind of just build up to what you want to do in terms of just like, okay, here's how I'm filling out my sections. I would probably advise to not just stop. Like say you're building like a 475 yard cube or something like that. I wouldn't advise to just stop once you hit 475 to maybe just go a little bit higher and then just sculpting down. But again, that's not something you have to do. I just think that's probably just a good practice to do. And one of the things I would say is like, even though I've used an analogy of a house, is that your foundations aren't really set in stone. It's very much something that you can change. I think that tends to happen a lot in cube design too, where it's just like, I can't change this. Where it's just like your foundations aren't set in stone, they're made of gel. Like you can, if you're not happy, you're building your cube and then you're just like, these artifacts are terrible. I don't want to put 10 more artifacts because I don't want to search through Skyfall and I hate this. You can just add 2 cards to Uber and then it's totally fine. You don't have to do that. And it's just something you can just trim, make fine room for it later. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of cubes tend to use other cubes as a base. Like when I built my first cube in 2008, 2009, I just used a lot of other cubes and then just reverse engineered from there. And it's just a lot easier because it does a lot of the work for you. It's kind of like going into a house and it's already built. And like that's a lot easier. And it's like, it's definitely not something that's bad to do in terms of that. But I would say what I would do if you are using a popular list or other list is to identify what you like in them, even if it's just like this list is popular. Because it lets you define what you're looking for in a cube. Bonus points if you've actually played it. That way you can kind of identify like what things about it that you do like. I've known people who copy the magic on like vintage cube and like, I don't like these mid-range cards, so I'm just going to cut them. And then just put in more combo things. Again, that's something they know and they have a context. They don't have to worry about sections and everything. And if they do, they can always just change those later because the work's already been done for them. And you can always use the best practices we talked about just earlier in terms of just like redundancy and just like building to color parent synergy and payoff. Like you can use all of that totally when you're using other cubes. It's a lot like a recipe. Whenever I tend to look for a recipe online, like say I want to learn how to make like fake mac and cheese, like I'm not just going to look at one recipe. Like I'll usually look up several and be like, okay, this one talks about using like dry mustard. This one talks about using like salt or something. And just like these use about X, Y, Z, and I just go from there. And it's just like taking bits and pieces. Kind of what I talked about earlier, like if you find a panel like totally useless, but like, hey, this example makes sense, like, yeah, great, do that. Well, one thing I would say in terms of that is just like, don't be afraid to just add stuff that you just like. Like not everything has to be just like juiced to the max in terms of the cube. It's like if you just want to add stuff that's just like is your own spice, like pretty much any cube that I have ever is going to have airplane blade in it because I personally love the cards. Maybe it's just also a good card anyway, but like that and galvanic glass are just great cards that I tend to have in terms, and it could be considered like my own spice. But it's just something like, you know, you just make a recipe and you just like, I'm gonna add some smoked paprika. Yeah, as long as it works. There was an idea, there was a Tulare Community College video about cube where it talked about just like in a cube, the ethos is that everything should be just like, everything should be amazing, and there should be no junk, there should be no filler. And I got the concept that he's going for, but I think the idea is that everything should, it's not so much that there should be nothing that's just like no jank or anything, because that's also subjective too, but that everything should realistically have a purpose. And that's also part of your target audience as well. Like if there's cards that people just generally like, or you just put a card altar of like, say, your cat or something, which I have like several of them in my own view. But it's just building to that in terms of knowing your target audience. And also just don't be afraid to try some new stuff in different ways. Like ginger is something that tends to be used in a lot of like Western cuisine just in a dessert context. But like I'm South Asian and we tend to use it in like savory food as well, like ginger and garlic or like BFFs. And when I was starting to date my wife, she was unfamiliar with that, and this is now just something that you tend to do. And it's something that may not have thought of. Or just like using like, you know, pumpkin spice instead of cinnamon, instead of just like butter cinnamon anyway, that's what I always say. So it's like, you're just doing it in terms of just like adding it to stuff. But it's just like that too, where it's just like, I'm gonna go and try galvanic glass or something. I'm gonna try like this card that may just be familiar to people in one context, and it totally works. A lot of these are, so the next few slides are just going to be kind of just general advice in terms of just like stuff I've learned over the years. Now that I realize that I have so much more time, I'll probably spend some more time on this. So I'll talk a lot slower on these, but I'll have a Q&A as well. So one thing I would say is just like cutting the card doesn't mean that it's gone forever. A lot of cube design, like people tend to talk about it in terms of just like this card is bad and this card is good. I did an article recently this week in terms of just like looking at updating a cube, and then there's a lot more than just like cutting cards that are bad. And it's like I talked about earlier, sometimes the card just needs a different context in terms of just like searching through cards or just like how cards work over time. And that tends to be useful in terms of like just having a name for it. The second point is like if you have to help use it, like in terms of just like when I started my cube, maybe it's just unique to me, but like when I started my cube, I pretty much did it myself, and I didn't really have to. And some of the stuff like logistics in terms of like scanning sleeves, like it's not something you tend to think about in terms of just like starting a cube. It's just like getting sleeves, getting a box, sleeving it up. Like it takes a very long time. And if you're doing it yourself versus having help, it definitely helps to have help for it. In terms of point number 3, and that's kind of a point I wanted to hammer home in terms of this, like if you don't know the answer to something, or if you find something that doesn't work and that changes, that's totally okay. Cube design is very much a learning process, and it's just like sometimes you'll try something and it just doesn't work, and don't feel bad about that. It's just cube is about learning, and sometimes you'll be like, okay, this experiment I wanted to try out didn't work. That's fine, like that's okay. It's part of learning. Like cube is also just a learning process, and you're just if you're starting a cube and just building it over time, you're going to learn a lot in terms of what works and what doesn't, and that's okay. Like it's just growth as a player and as a designer. Also, in terms of just like how things don't have to be perfect, like this is a big thing I always talk about. It's just like don't let perfect get in the way of good. I know a lot of people are, or at least like I've known people over the years when they're building a cube, like they're like, I want to make a cube that's 500 bucks, but I only have like 400, but I want to draft it. Like still do it. Like you don't have to have it be absolutely perfect to be, make it work. Or it's like I don't know if I have enough reps in with these cards, or I don't know if these cards are going to be good enough. Like that's fine. In terms of that, like in terms of these kinds of things, perfect balance is a relatively imperfect ideal. Like I hear a lot of cube design talk meeting about just like everything is perfectly in balance, and it really isn't. As long as you get your macros fine, like everything should fall into place. A lot of cube design is about push and pull, and like you're just going to adjust things over time, and that's okay. The other point is like your cube will always be changing. Like it's never finished. Like you're gonna design a cube and it's gonna change a lot over time, and that's also okay because things will always change. just like, that's just how it's going to be over time. And it's just like, it's not a set step where it's like you design your cube and you're done. Like, it's going to change over time. And again, it's just a learning process of what you want to do with it. Also, one thing is I would suggest don't sweat the small things. Even though I spent like a long time writing about the small things, like I've learned over the years, it's like you don't really need to sweat the small things as a designer. You can always change stuff. Like there's a quote by Aesop which says something like, "A crust eaten in peace is better than a banquet partaken in anxiety," and that's so true. Like it's like you're building your cube and it's like, man, I got like 5 blue cards that I can't decide what to cut, and like everything else is out of balance. Like that's fine. Just draft it like that. Like you'll figure it out later. Like that's okay. Some other things is just don't be afraid to see how it's drafted. Like you don't have to do 3 packs of 15. You can always do like 4 packs of 10, 4 packs of 11, stuff like that. Like don't feel like you have to be beholden to do something just because that's the way other people do it. Don't feel like you have to do anything like for like cycles or aesthetic purposes. That was a big thing. Just in terms of like this doesn't look right in my cube. In my cube cover list, it doesn't really matter. A lot of the times drafters aren't going to notice. Like you'll probably care about it a lot more than your drafters, and it does not matter at all. And also, just like don't be afraid to try stuff on your own. Like, a lot of my cube design writing over the years was just challenging a lot of orthodoxy. It was like signature mouse slamping, aggro bad, or just like link walkers are too good. It was just like that doesn't make sense. And I was just like, I'm just going to do this on my own and make this and just figure out why these statements are happening and if this actually like any truth to it. Most of the time, there really wasn't. There's a video that made me think about it in terms of just like, so like in terms of cooking, one of the ideas is that you're supposed to flip your steak every you're supposed to put the steak on. You're supposed to get a sear on it to set the crust. That's kind of just like one of those like culinary things you're supposed to do, like set in stone through years, where it's like don't wash your mushrooms. And it's just like there was videos out there which show like why that doesn't actually make sense. Just doing the science. You can't really do the science for cube. Like you can track data just to kind of do things quantitatively. You can also just like try stuff on your own. You're like, yeah, that doesn't make sense. Why that doesn't make sense at all. The last one of these slides that I'm going to talk about is kind of just using iterative design. One of the big things about this picture here on the right side is from the the oval walkways at the Ohio State University. The black and white picture is how the campus was defined at first, and then the one on the bottom is. If you look at a picture, you'll see some solid paths there, and then you'll see these like walked paths they're kind of just like not as well defined. The ones that are as well defined are just like what the students did, because that's the way they found was the best way to walk between certain buildings, like that one over there and the upper part of there. They found it was just better to walk that way. And it's kind of that way, so like what happened in that picture on the bottom was that when they were working on the campus, they designed these paths that had actual roadways based on what the students were doing. And it's kind of like that, where as a designer, what you'll want to do is take drafter feedback and what they do into your account. Because they'll see stuff that you don't, you're just one person, and when other people draft it, like, oh yeah, this doesn't work, or just like, I don't think there was enough burn for my red text. Even if it's like, maybe that's not a correct point of view, per se, like maybe they just draft something to take into account. It's got something to take into account. It's kind of like when Gordon Ramsay said, like, I don't care about the positive feedback I get from restaurants. I just care about the negative feedback. It's kind of like that, where it's just getting it. It's just like, if anything, it's getting what people think about what's going on. And used almost all the time, it's helpful. In terms of that, like one of the phrases that's really resonated with me is like, the cube is bigger than you. I actually wrote on it about that as well. But just like, something that like you may hold very strongly about, but just know that there's like way more people drafting than you, and like if they're seeing something and you aren't, it's probably it's probably not just them. They're probably correct in this way to do it. It's also just like, so one of the things I did in one of my cubes is just like I had an issue and like I was tracking my deck data. That's also going to be in terms of just like how it was impacting the format, and it really wasn't overwhelmingly powerful, but it was just a miserable experience for people. And I was like, yeah, I don't care about initiative, but the cube is bigger than me. So I'm just going to take these cards out, and that was probably a net top. I didn't really miss it because I wanted to make it a better experience for other people. One of the things, other track your decks. I think that's a big thing people should do. You know, if you have like you create a personal Discord, just take a picture of it with your camera phone and just write the record on it. Like, you know, this deck went 2-1, this deck went 3-0. You don't have to. I used to use a spreadsheet to track deck data. You really don't have to. It's a lot of work. And like, but if you take pictures over time, you can see trends happening. Like, it's not perfect, but it's something like you see red-white aggro just like 3-0 every week. It's like, okay, something's going on here, and I may have to fix some stuff. But it's like that too. And that's the point where you make a Discord, even if it's just a personal one for just storing pictures of decks. It's really super useful. Just like, oh, what deck? How did decks done this past week? Like, what's winning? What's losing? You can use that information to kind of just be more quantitative rather than trying to remember, like, man, is Firebolt even really good anymore? And it's like looking for decks, I'm like, yeah, it's still pulling its weight. Like, it's either that or red decks are still doing well. But it's also just useful for just like organizing and collaborating with people. And the last point I would say, in terms of just like game design, is just like have fun. Like that's the big thing. Like I talked about like macro and major and like all this like dry stuff and all this. And it sounds like it's this big undertaking, which it kind of is. But like if you break it down, it makes it a lot easier. But just have fun. Like it's not your job. So you don't have to, you know, it's a fun project, you know, just like, and it is, the experience of having people draft your cubes is really cool. And it's just like, have fun. It's a fun process. Like, you know, like I said, you don't even have to do like a lot of procedures I talked about. You know, just like find what works for you, and just have fun with it, you know. It's like that joking too, just have fun with it. Yeah, that's my presentation. I'm leaving this part for Q&A, so if y'all have any questions, or if you want to clap, I don't know. You don't have to. Sweet, thank you. Yeah, I put this question in elemental on if you had any questions. Like, I see a question. Hello.
What's a cube you tried to make that did not go the way you planned? Like you wanted it to do one thing, but the way you drafted it, or it just didn't pan out and it was fine.
Yeah, so like I would say one cube that I did where it didn't. I would say it was like I made like an artifact cube, and I was just like I'm gonna go and design this to like see how this works. And what ended up happening was just like I built it very much as an artifact-based cube, where it's just like there's a whole bunch of artifacts and the archetypes are based on artifacts. And I had a lingering thought in the back of my head. It's like, I think what's going to happen is just like green, because green doesn't historically do a lot with artifacts, right? So like, I was like, okay, so what's going to happen is green's going to be the hate color, and then that's going to be fine. What ended up happening is just like, it's like that picture from what's that movie, War Games, where it's just like the correct game to play is like not to play or something. It was just like that, where it's just like, okay, I'll just draft all the hate cards and just hate everything. I was like, well, this isn't good. And then I think I just like ended up scrapping the cube anyway because other stuff was more just like enjoyable. But I think that was a good example where it's like, yeah, this didn't work out. And this other thing was like, I learned a lesson from it because not like, I think one thing in terms of like lessons, I think, I don't remember what slide it was, probably like this or something, I don't know, one of these. Where it's just like, I'm gonna use a magic example and just like overall magic. It's like if you like learn a card, like say like, oh, okay, I have this opinion of this card, and then it's just like say BB or something from the Final Fantasy set. It's just like, okay, BB is, that's probably not a great example. I don't know if BB is a good example for a lot of things. But I was gonna say like, I don't know, like Shieldred, I think is a good example where it's just like, it was a card when it was revealed, people were just like, this card's okay. And then it just ended up just like taking over a lot of formats. And I think it's one thing, in terms of learning lessons, is just like level 0 is just like, oh, Shieldred is a good card. Hooray, I'll play these in my black decks now. Like that's just like very base level, and like learning lessons of like, part one is just like why? Like why is it better than you think? It's just like, just like big toughness, it's a good top deck, all this other fun stuff makes draws bad. And there's all these other points where it's not just like, it's also just not like reading the cards like, oh, it has 5 toughness, so it does X, Y, Z. It's just like learning what made it good and like learning where you messed up. Like, so I do cube set reviews for every lots of sets. I think I took a brief, I stopped doing them a lot during COVID, and then like I started back on them recently. And it's like, I'll usually just rate cards on a power level, be like, hey, this card is good, X, Y, Z. This card's bad. And I don't get them all right, nobody does. But it's just like, where did I learn my lesson? Like, where was this wrong? Like, I think Roy was pretty underrated. I was just like, I could just say, this dies removal. And it's like, what if it doesn't? And I'll test this card out when we do draft. That's the point I think I should say is just like, I don't think it was in this slide, but it's just like, if you can test cards out and just like get feedback from your drafters, I guess that is kind of like point one, where it's just like, you test cards out, you try them, see what people think, like, hey, what did you think of the card next? I'm so annoying during preview season with people. I'm like, hey, what did you think of this card? Just think of this card. And it's probably like annoying, but sorry, that's what you signed up for. Anyway, sorry about that long answer, but hello.
Hi. You put up some numbers for general cube sizes. Do those also apply if you want them to draft their lands because you're an evil person and
like desert cubes?
or snow?
Oh, okay. Yeah, so like, I would say in terms of overall numbers, like, and I think I totally skipped over this point. I don't know why I did. So like, when I was doing my research for this presentation last year, I found out that like 15% of like, for Ruberg is around 50 to 60% in a lot of cubes. It's kind of like a base rate. Lands were about 15%, and like the rest was just whatever. But like, I think that does change based on like, yeah, if you have to draft your own lands, like that probably changes like 20-25%. But that's where I would say drafting your cube on Cube Pro, like using the bots, that's what I probably should have put in here. I probably should have put it as one of those good points, but like, use draft, like, I just said, like, you're gonna learn a lot of stuff over time, but like, doing a draft of, you put your list on a Cube Progress page, and then you draft it. Like, as soon as you do your first draft, you're probably gonna realize some things like, oh man, this needs more land. Like, the bots aren't perfect, of course, like, they can be questionable, and if you're doing weird stuff, like, it's gonna be even weirder. Like, how do I take this land, like, basic, like, this snow land, like, what? It's probably not gonna be perfect, but like, doing your first few drafts, like, helps a lot in terms of helping to realize that, like, stuff with, like, spreadsheets and quantifying stuff with, like, math nerds and stuff like me would do. But just, like, I would say, intuitively, 20 to 25% land is what you would want to do for a cube like that, but, like, I would probably do that, jam some drafts, see what happens, and, like, see if it's meeting your goals for what you want your metagame to do. Sweet. Hello.
Hello. I don't understand the distinction you made earlier about the difference between macro and micro versus CubeCon. You seem to me that the macro approach was really the decisions about decisions for.
Yeah, I'm gonna go walk closer to you because I'm old and I can't hear you. Hello.
Hello.
Hey.
Good to see you.
Thank you.
I'm having trouble understanding the distinction you made between macro and micro design.
Ah.
Yeah, it seems to me that what's characterized as macro shapes, they look like, I'm not going to use specific words, where it's certainly like a broad reason, but it's still like specific words.
Yeah.
So am I just like saying the difference between those words?
I probably didn't articulate it that well, honestly. I'll go back here. So like, I would say like the difference between like macro and micro is just like, so I'll go back to the slide here, that's also why I'm watching here. So like, if I go to, there we go. So like, some of these are kind of representative of big things you can do. Like Sensei's Divining Top is just like not including that, is a representation of like a bigger macro level thing you can do, like not including cards that are banned in Vintage and Legacy. So like, that's a macro choice you can do, is just like, okay, I don't want cards that are banned in Legacy and Vintage. Like that is a macro level choice that you can do to dictate what your cube metagame looks like. Same thing with like not including passageway sear and like extending that. I think that's the idea. It's like I probably did a terrible job of saying like you extend these choices out. Like you don't want the initiative because that mechanic is absolutely miserable. So like I'm not including any of these, including passageway sear. Same thing with brain freeze. It's just like not necessarily just storm, like just not just this card, but like the fact that not including storm can have a very macro level impact on what your cube does. Because storm is a very like parasitic mechanic where you have to have like not only storm cards, but just like rituals and just like all these other kind of things to support it, and just also to have that critical mass to be able to be drafted. So it's a decision that can have a pretty big macro level impact, aside from just not having brain freeze and critic shot and like all those fun stuff. It's also just a big decision. In terms of like Taurus Garrison, like that's another thing where it's just like, do you want to have a lot of lands, or just like that's a knob you can kind of tune in terms of cube design. In terms of just like, do I want to have a lot of lands? Because that also impacts things like how greedy decks can be, or if it's just like the quality. Like one of the things I did in the Replica Cube was wanting to make sure a lot of the lands that I had entered untapped. Boros Garrison was like, that cycle was an exception because they entered tapped, so I couldn't do that. But like most of the other lands did. So it was a decision I made to kind of make sure that aggressive decks were still good and to make sure decks could curve out. But like something like this, if I was to say like including lots of land, that would be representative of what a macro level decision would do. As opposed to something like this where it's just like gut is like a power level outlier that's just an individual card that is just straight up toxic. Spider-Man, the middle card of Spider-Man, probably not a great example actually, because like Universe Beyond are individual cards, I think that can change things in terms of card availability, but like also Call of the Death Road kind of, because it's like an individual card that has just a lot of complexity, that it could also theoretically represent what you have available in terms of just like other complexity things. Because like Cryogen is Cryogen, it's a card's big. Does that make sense?
I believe I see the distinction you're trying to make.
Okay. Yeah, the lines are a little bit blurry sometimes. This is like sometimes it's just like is an X or Y or something. It's like the whole like square rectangle thing where it's just like maybe this is of this and this is of this. But it's overall, I would say overall, it's just like it's kind of like what I was pointing to earlier. It's just like realizing you can kind of adjust things from like this high level perspective, or just on the individual power level cards. Just like on the individual level, like individual cards. Like I'm gonna include Signal Pass because it's a good card, and sometimes it's just an individual card versus just like I'm gonna make these macro level decisions. But it's something that I would say is probably super important, and like honestly, it may not even realistically matter. But it's just like you can do both of these things. Yeah, you're welcome. Sorry, it was a very long answer. I tend to do that. All right. Does anybody have any other questions? Hello. So what I would say, I actually have a friend who has a mono white cube, and it's kind of similar. Like, so what I wanted to do with this panel was to kind of like, sometimes when I see articles talking about cube, they tend to look at the lens that they're most familiar with. Like, I'm going to tell you how to make a cube, and it's kind of like couched in a like, here's how to make a vintage cube, and just doing it through that context. And it wasn't really super useful for somebody who wants to do something like that. But I would say, in terms of building a restricted cube, you kind of do, like say, I'll use the mono white cube for example. What he did was, there's kind of some things that overlap. Like, you're probably going to want to look at what your metagame will be expected to look like. Cube size, the section structure will still be a thing, but like, for example, if I go to this point here, like you're definitely can do either in terms of just like, if it's a mono white, that's the entire thing in terms of how you're defining what you want the color pair or what the things to do. I'd probably say just like, looking at what you want the archetypes to look like is probably the big thing. And it's probably also that colorless is probably going to be a bigger section in there. Like multicolor will probably be hybrid, but they're just white cards. in the grand scheme of things. But a lot of it is kind of these kind of similar structures in terms of just like, how are you defining the archetypes in the format? Like, mono white is just like, so my friend's mono white cube had a lot of like enchantment stuff. There was like an aggressive deck. There was like blink kind of stuff. And so I had a friend who was designing a cube. Not this, but he was just asking like, how many numbers do you want to put in there? And I was like, that's not really a great answer to that. Like, I just was like, you design to how you want it to look, and then you kind of tinker the number based on that. Like with the whole, like I was saying earlier, in terms of just like jamming some drafts on CubeCon, being like, okay, I'm gonna look at what the numbers look like, and kind of like, one of the things you can do is like test, like if I could force it back. It's not perfect, but it can kind of show that as a like proof of concept. But it's like mono white or like mono green, or it's just like, okay, what do I want my green decks to look like? Like say elves, big stompy things, planeswalkers. I'm just trying to think of archetypes. Green is like my least color, I'm sorry. But like, I'll say mono white, just because that was a good example. It's like auras, artifact synergies, aggressive decks, blank, stuff like that, and then kind of doing it from a top-down level and defining like what they look like from there. And like, colorless probably plays, or not probably, it does play a bigger role, and that's something that you can also use. Because colorless is also kind of like this in terms of just like how you can shape your archetypes, even though they're all in a monocolored cube, they're all color agnostic anyway. But it's like where you can kind of like turn knobs to things like, okay, I'm gonna put more aggressive decks like Signal Pest, or I'm trying to think of was it Ginger Boot or something, or just like equipment and just like what equipment they're on, or just like Stoneforge and Cauldron, you know. Again, I'm trying to think of great examples, but I'm just terrible at it. I'm not even a major card. I'm a Jeskai player and a Grixis player. I'm just terrible. But I would say doing that is just like defining how you want your world to look like. I'd say is probably more important for a monocolored cube to look more at the big picture kind of stuff. Defining what you want it to look like from there, and then just like tinkering it with it on the micro level once you have a picture of what you want things to look like. Because that's the thing too, it's like you go into a house, you build the house, and then you're just like, man, this wall is too high or something. It's like, I can't reach this, I can't reach the milk in my cabinet or something. I feel like you just do these micro level changes. Like, okay, I'm just gonna move the milk down here, and like the eggs somewhere better or something. You know, just something like that where you make these kind of micro level changes. And that, I think, is probably, that is how I would do it. Cool. Is there any other questions? I mean, I could blab on for hours. Or not. I don't want to annoy anybody. Like, get this guy off stage. Sweet. Trying to think of other, you had another question?
How much multicolor is too much?
How much?
Multicolor.
So, multicolor, I would say, is complicated. Because, like, the thing about multicolor is, I'm going the wrong way. Let's go this way. So, like, I'm going the wrong way again. Good job. You know, there we go. Yeah, we got there. So, like, multicolor, I found one of the things, like, a lot of my early cube experience, it's kind of like, I think of it like a band, where it's like, a band's early years are like what they listen to define like how the band sounds. Like, I'm trying to think of an example, like I don't know, like early Sepultura or something, or early Metallica. They listen to a lot of like, early metal, and that's how they define their sound. For me, a lot of my early cube experience was defined by cubes that had way too much multicolor and not really good aggressive sections. The issue with multicolor is that multicolor is definitely different than hybrid, because like, I know it sounds cliche, but like multicolor is like a drawback and hybrid is a boon. It's just like more decks versus less. But thinking about it in terms of just like the strict multicolor stuff, the availability of it is defined by how good your fixing is. So like the Rabbit cube that I built was very much based on a lot of multicolor, just like because it was based on Rabbit. But what I did was made sure there was a lot of hybrid stuff so that decks could still not do the whole soup thing. What I would say in terms of just like how much multicolor is too much, it's it's very much defined by what your meta is. I would say a problem is if there's not a good early game depth. Like this whole rock, paper, scissors thing that I brought up here. One of the things is in cubes that don't have a good early game depth, the whole scissors thing, if there is a lot of multicolor, those decks can just dirtle around. It's like, okay, I'll just take all the fixing. You tended to see that in a lot of cubes in the early days, where it's just like, I'll just take like all the lands and just take like a multicolored hand sandwich because like nobody else wants this tricolor thing. And then just easily 3-0. That was usually what I used to do back in the day. And you kind of saw that in Tarkir Dragonstorm, where it was just like, it was essentially an arms race between like the Boros decks, or like the early game decks, and then like the 5-color decks, because the payoff was just better to be super greedy, and it was just like, can your deck handle the early game decks? I would probably not consider Tarkir Dragonstorm an aspiration in terms of that. Yeah, exactly. But I would say probably another thing where it's just like, the early game deck strength is very much a factor in terms of how much is too much multicolor. But I would say it's very easy to get too much multicolor because like the rates on multicolor cards are just better. So it could be very easy to be like, okay, here's a lightning helix, and that's just so much better than a lightning strike. And then just like, if you're not careful, having too much. But again, that's one of those things where it's like, if you jam a bunch of cube drafts, it's like, all right, I'm seeing all these tricolor cards going around the table, like 13, 15 picks, and like on the journal deck, it was funny because my cat Chrono, he was emblematic of like these multicolored decks. We call them Chrono decks because he's a greedy orange cat, as they do, and B, he was polydactyl, so of course he was greedy. He had like 5, he had like thumbs and everything. But yeah, it was, I would say probably, it can be easy. I don't know if I have a good number for it. And it may sound like a cop-out answer, and it probably is. But I would say it is very dependent on things. But I would probably say like, it's another thing where it's like, you build it, and you can always tailor with it based on some drafts. I would say probably it's like a thing to do too. It's just like, before you commit to like getting cards for a cube, it's just like jamming some drafts, and then just like, then committing. It's like, okay, I'm gonna buy these cards. It's like jam some drafts first. You'll find stuff changes over time. Like, that's why I hammer these points home about just like, things will change. Everything will always change. Don't feel bad about things. Sweet. All right. Are there any other questions?
Would you like to tell us how many NIF visits is too many NIF visits?
Do what now?
How many NIF visits is too many NIF visits, and then I think we can go.
How many is too many? I would say, I don't know how many have been printed. I always forget. I always see
6 or 7.
6 or 7. I would say 8.
Okay.
8 is too many, I guess. Like, I'll take non-joke answer. I'd probably say like.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Sweet. Well, thank you everybody. Thank you for listening to me babble. Hopefully not thank you. Thanks for class. Have a good evening, everybody. I'll probably do. There we go.